For many people, the mere mention of the word mafia conjures up images of men in dark suits and hats tipping their fedoras, while giving orders to terrified citizens on the streets of New York or Las Vegas. For others, the name elicits memories of Godfather movies with epic fistfights over family dinners and betrayals that would put Game of Thrones to shame. But most people forget that it all began with a single word in Italy. Most people are only aware of two mafia groups today. There's the American Mafia, also known as the Italian-American Mafia, or the La Cosa Nostra, and the Japanese Mafia, better known as the Yakuza. But before either of these organizations existed, there was the Sicilian Mafia. And to understand how the Mafia grew from an underground organization of peasants in Sicily to controlling much of organized crime in America, you have to go back to the beginning. The exact origins of the Mafia are difficult to pinpoint, because for most of its early existence, the group operated in secrecy. What we do know is that it rose to prominence in the mid-19th century, when Sicily was going through some major changes. For centuries, Sicily had been ruled by the Spanish monarchy. But in 1860, Italian revolutionaries led by Giuseppe Garibaldi invaded the island and overthrew the Spanish. A year later, Sicily became part of a newly unified Italy. Sicily and Italy were very different at the time. Sicily was predominantly an agricultural economy based on large estates or latifundios owned by wealthy landowners, who employed poor Sicilians as sharecroppers or farm laborers. Although these landowners enjoyed the benefits of a unified Italy, many Sicilians saw little difference between Spanish and Italian rule. They continued to live in poverty and had no political power. The result was a volatile mix of desperation and resentment that would serve as the foundation for the Mafia. In the decades following Italian unification, secret societies began to form across the island, made up of peasants and small landowners, who wanted to overturn the social order and seize land for themselves. These groups often used violence to achieve their goals, attacking landlords and their property in the hopes of scaring them off. But this didn't always work. Some landlords fought back, hiring bodyguards to protect them. So these peasant groups evolved into something more permanent, developing group structures, rituals, and codes that would eventually become synonymous with the Mafia. The most prominent of these groups were the Scalfunters, the Mafiosos, and the Black Hand. Although each of these groups were unique, they shared three common characteristics that defined the early Mafia. First, members lived by a strict code of honor and secrecy. If you weren't born into the Mafia, you couldn't join it. And if you were, you had to swear an oath of silence, or breaking this oath meant leaving the group without your head. Second, Mafia members were bound together by blood ties. Each member was related to every other member either by birth or marriage, which helped maintain secrecy within the group and ensured loyalty. Finally, the early Mafia relied heavily on intimidation and fear to achieve their goals. Instead of trying to win over the hearts and minds of Sicilians, the Mafia sought to control them through fear, often employing a tactic called pizzo, where merchants were extorted to pay a fee in exchange for protection. During this time period, there were also notable differences between the various groups. For example, while some were content to simply protect local farmers from outside threats, others sought to expand their influence and power. Engaging in activities like bootlegging and gambling, the most notable of these groups was the Cosa Nostra, which emerged in the early 20th century under the leadership of Don Matteo Messina Denaro. Unlike other mafia groups, the Cosa Nostra wasn't bound to one geographic location. Instead, they built a loose network of alliances with other groups across the island, allowing them to operate more like a business than a gang. This move not only brought them more power, but more wealth as well, thanks to a new criminal enterprise, drug trafficking. By the end of World War II, the Sicilian Mafia had grown substantially, largely due to the introduction of a new product, heroin. Because of its proximity to Africa, Sicily had long been a hub for hashish traders. But the arrival of heroin in the early 20th century changed everything. It was cheaper, easier to transport, and highly addictive, which meant big profits for the traffickers. Soon, various mafia groups were flooding the streets of New York with heroin, bringing in millions of dollars and establishing the foundations for the American Mafia. But why did Italian Americans join the Mafia? Well, it started with immigration. Between 1880 and 1930, more than 4 million Italians came to America, most of whom settled in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Many worked in dangerous industries like construction or mining, where accidents were common. In fact, by 1906, nearly half of all Italian immigrants in America were employed in the mining industry. But if you were injured or killed in an accident, there was no workers' compensation. Your family would be left penniless, which is where the Mafia came in. Members of the Italian Mafia offered their services as insurance of a sort. They paid for funerals and took care of the families of deceased miners. But to get these services, you had to join the Mafia and pay a fee, which meant the Mafia grew rapidly during this time period. But it wasn't just the immigrant communities that embraced the Mafia. Many native-born Americans joined as well, particularly during the Great Depression when legitimate jobs were hard to come by. The Mafia provided a way out of poverty and a chance to make good money. All you had to do was commit crimes. With so many new members, the Mafia grew rapidly throughout the 1920s and 30s. At its peak, there were reportedly 25,000 members strong, spread out over several hundred local families. Although the American Mafia wasn't directly controlled by the Sicilian Mafia, they shared a common structure that included 5 main families or kosh, which were broken down into smaller groups or crews. Within each crew, there was a boss, a consigliere or counselor, a capo or a chief, a soldier, and an associate. Associates were outsiders who did odd jobs for the crew, like driving a car or acting as a lookout. Soldiers were the foot soldiers of the crew who carried out violent tasks such as killing rivals or intimidating witnesses. The capo oversaw the activities of several soldiers and was responsible for making sure that the crew's illegal activities ran smoothly. The consigliere acted as the crew's legal advisor, but also served as a voice of reason, often trying to talk the boss out of risky moves. The boss, however, had final say over all crew activities and was ultimately responsible for its success or failure. So what did the American Mafia do exactly? Well, anything they could make money from? During the Prohibition era, the Mafia thrived on bootlegging, the illegal production and sale of alcohol. By the end of Prohibition, Mafia families were raking in millions of dollars a year from illegal breweries, distilleries, and nightclubs. After Prohibition ended, however, the Mafia diversified, moving into casinos, illegal gambling, prostitution, and even legitimate businesses like construction and waste management. They also branched out into extortion, a practice called the pizzo, where local shop owners were forced to pay a fee to the Mafia in exchange for protection. If you refused to pay, your store would be destroyed. During the 20th century, the Mafia reached its peak power and influence. With thousands of members spread across the United States, they bribed politicians, intimidated law enforcement, and even had ties to organized crime families in Russia and Japan. But despite their seeming invincibility, the Mafia's power has waned since the 1970s, due in part to increased pressure from law enforcement and the government. Several high-ranking members have been convicted on racketeering charges, which has broken the Mafia's traditional structure and made it harder for them to operate. Today, the American Mafia is a shadow of its former self, with only about 2,000 members remaining. That doesn't mean they're gone for good. The Mafia has proven to be resilient in the past, and will likely continue to survive in some form for years to come. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button